Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. What would you answer if I asked you to define what sword this is? If you're in any way already part of the sword community or follow sword media online, you probably will know that this is a little bit of a cheap rhetorical question, and that is for two reasons. The first is that you already know where this answer is going. And the second is that this topic has already been, or at least this part of the topic I'm going to talk about has already been addressed in a number of videos by I Post Swords, for example, by That Sword Guy, and most recently by the Latrex in his history of the Scimitar. And I kind of gave away the answer there to the first point a little. Some may define this as a scimitar, whereas others would have a more precise definition for it. People have wanted to clarify how the term scimitar is a useless term, let's say at the harsh end of things, useless and possibly with racist undertones and connotations, or on the softer side of things, how it's simply not very useful term because it kind of covers a too broad scope of swords. So this means it was initially, I won't even go deep into the history because it's already been covered, of course, but it initially comes from Italian and French, cimitarra in Italian, which is possibly a translation of shamshir. And while it was initially intended to represent a specific kind of curved sword, it then ballooned the term to cover all kinds of curved swords. This obviously makes the term weak in the sense that it, well, what are we talking about when we talk about scimitar? So in the sword community, it's often frowned upon, the use of this term, because, well, it's useless. But also because, well, this is specifically a point I Post Swords makes, it has potentially some problematic or racist connotations, perhaps, in the sense that it's used to represent the other weapon, so something that's not part of the us as the European community, but is part of everything that is outside of those boundaries. But the question here is, and finally I'm getting to the theme of the video of today, is this issue with vagueness a specific issue of the term scimitar, or is it something more broadly visible in a lot of different sword denominations? And this is an important question to answer, I think, because if we can kind of confine the issue to one term, scimitar, we can say, okay, that's a negative term for historical reasons and for accuracy reasons, and we just don't use it, and we have a lot of other terms we can use, and then we're kind of safe. But what if pulling that scimitar rug from beneath our feet actually uncovers way more vagueness? If this vagueness is applicable to many other different kinds of swords, that puts us in a very awkward position, because how can we communicate properly about swords? Or how can we approach sword communication in a way that takes into account the fact that terms are kind of unstable and their definitions move around a lot? And let's take a look at this. Now, this is a composite we'll take a look at in another video, but the blade is in kind of the general shape of what would have been a European storta. So storta is an Italian term, and it means crooked, literally. And you can probably see why, because it's referencing a curved sword. This term originates already sometime in the Middle Ages and has been used for a long time. We're still using it, of course. But as I mentioned, it has a lot of variation within it. So initially, it was the Italian word to refer to a kind of sword that came from Spain, and in Spain was probably influenced by Arab style of short and curved swords. The Spanish name was alfañe, and so it referenced a specific sword with a very specific origin. And in a way, the term storta mirrors exactly what happens with the word scimitar. In fact, the term storta becomes a kind of cover-all solution for curved blades, including curved blades from other cultures and populations. And the overlap is so step by step, so it's so mirrored that already in the 1600s, if you look at the Italian Vocabolario degli Accademici della Crusca, this is a long name, it's basically the reference, the linguistic reference for Italian. So already in the 1600s, in their edition of their dictionary, if you looked for the term storta had completely overlapped with scimitar to the point that when looking for a definition of storta, you're referred to the term scimitar. And a similar overlap we can see with the word alfagne, again, in a Spanish to Italian dictionary from the same time, so early 1600s. You have a similar definition whereby alfagne is defined as scimitar. Well, what's interesting here is that it kind of moves our interpretation from the word scimitar being a one word that gets chosen or becomes the word to represent the otherness and to represent kind of a vague, uncultured, in a sense, approach to classifying weapons. But we can see it's a little more complex than that, in the sense that around similar times, perhaps, we have three terms competing. We have scimitar, we have storta, and we have alfagne, which all represent a similar ballooning of some semantic field, if you want, of meaning for the swords they represent. So they start from a specific to go to a general. And the reason why this happens, this is just my hypothesis, I suppose, is that what we see is also a geographical expansion of European countries. But see, we're starting to move into, in these couple centuries, into the phase of, well, new contact with different cultures, different people, and obviously new and different styles of weapons. So it kind of makes sense that a term that was used to kind of define relatively, perhaps specifically, a certain kind of weapon or a weapon from a certain geographical area kind of expands to meet different weapons of which perhaps there's little to no understanding. And just to give an idea of how extreme this shift in meaning or this expansion of meaning is for the word, even the word storta that starts out as a pretty specific, or today we know as a relatively specific kind of term, is not only becomes synonymous of scimitar, not only gets substituted by the word scimitar, but in earlier times, so we're talking here about the end of the 1500s, it's used in the Storie delle Indie Orientali, if I'm not mistaken, by Maffei, which is a book, a travel book about, well, traveling to the East Indies, but it includes also the definition or description of katanas, and these are described as stortas. They're called storta. And you may be thinking, okay, but what's the point of all of this? Yes, it's true. We have three terms, alfagne, storta, and scimitar, and they all have a similar evolution from specific to generic, at least until a point, and then back to specific, perhaps, for storta, and into oblivion, in a sense, for the term scimitar. But it kind of makes sense, right? We're talking about terms that are all very interconnected. If you think about the time in which these terms evolve, they're kind of perhaps overlapping. They even overlap in terms of geography. So, of course, Arab swords influence the alfagne influences the storta, Persian shamshir possibly influences the term scimitar, and these are all curved swords from a kind of generally you can pinpoint a geographical area. So we're talking about the Middle East or the Near East, areas with which European merchants or soldiers had a lot of interaction with. But surely other kinds of swords have a more specific, we can kind of define them better. So still, this is a bit of a self-standing problem, and we can just not use these generic terms and refer to more specific terms. But is that really the case? Well, I'm not so sure it is. Let's talk about rapier for a moment. Today, especially in the English world, the word rapier is rather specific. It has a lot of subgenres, and it's actually it's an umbrella term that covers a lot of different variations of swords and styles and measurements and features. But overall, if we say rapier today, we think about it as, okay, I know we can kind of pinpoint what style of sword we're talking about and what time frame, for example. It's a term that has a function, but it's kind of, in a sense, equally problematic, I think, to the word scimitar, in a sense, or to the words Storta or Alfagne in their more generic interpretation. So let's kind of look at the etymological history, very briefly, of the term rapier. So rapier comes from espada ropera, which is a Spanish generic term, you could say, perhaps, for dress sword. So it's not necessarily representing a style of sword in the sense that we would say today as a rapier. So something that's thrust centered. There's not like a set of rules of what defines an espada ropera. And here we see how also the English origin of the word rapier is in a way kind of similar to the word scimitar. I don't want to like overlap them completely, but if we're looking for similarities, I think we can find some. So in the same way as scimitar is a translation or bastardization, you could say, of perhaps the word shamshir, rapier through French is the evolution or bastardization of the term espada ropera, so it comes from that ropera. But what is interesting, apart from the way the word came to be, is how in English this word becomes a category of sword in and of itself. The rapier becomes a sword. If you go in the English-speaking world and talk about rapier, as we mentioned, it's kind of clear what we're talking about. But this isn't necessarily the case for other languages. So for example, if you look at Italian, well, Italian specifically that I know of, but I'm sure I know it's true for other languages, probably for Spanish as well and French. There is no such thing as a rapier. The word rapier does not translate into a concept. The closest thing would be a spada, so a sword, but that's a very, very generic term. In Italian, you would have spada da lato, you would have a striscia, you would have a stocco. You have a whole variation of different kinds of swords, but there's no overarching term to represent them. So in this sense, it brings into a problem that is similar to the scimitar problem. Rapier is similar in Italian in the sense that, well, first there isn't a word, but even if you say rapier, it's useless without other qualifiers. We're talking about a huge umbrella term that covers variety of features that make the term by itself kind of useless or ineffective. So, of course, rapiers can be all kinds of lengths. They can be purely thrusting weapons, but they can also have some cutting features or functionalities. They can have a whole variety of different styles of hilt, levels of decoration, provenances, of course. We have rapiers created in all of Europe with different regional variations. This means that the term rapier, in and of itself, is kind of as useless as the word scimitar, or should be, but it's not. We use it every day to kind of define a certain kind of sword. And this isn't to say that rapier should become a useless term as scimitar, or that we should dig out the term scimitar again to be used. Again, it's just to point out how there's a lot more complexity than what we usually consider when referring to swords. And while Storta, Alfagne, Rapier are maybe the more egregious examples of this kind of wide level of vagueness of terms when we talk about swords, there are other examples as well. The English cutlass. So, of course, that has come to represent a kind of a specific sword. I don't have one here, unfortunately. I think the closest thing would be that briquette with an unusual blade. But let's say if we're talking about a cutlass, that's simply evolution in English of the French couteau. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but basically knife. a term becomes, we have this, in this case it's almost the opposite though, right? In this case we're going from a generic term into a term that identifies a specific kind of sword. But it's just to show how there's this constant variation of all kinds. And the levels of complexity are many because we have geographical differences, of course. As we mentioned, the expanding of European merchants and soldiers or throughout the world brought to meeting new and different cultures, which obviously probably required time to be, even for the concept of their weapons or of their cultures to be understood in a sense. So filler words were used to cover them, in the case of Storta for the katana, for instance. But there are also more specific differences within European languages, as we saw with the term espada ropera and rapier. Well, and a similar thing can be said for the word saber. So now I have a saber, so I can hold it here. And in this case, we're talking about more specific how a word varies in its definition between very close regions. So, for example, in the English-speaking world, we would talk about a saber as a curved blade. I mean, we can go into more details, but we kind of all know what we're talking about when we're referring to sabers. And that's why a lot of people may be sometimes confused when looking at French swords. They see straight blades being referred to as sabers as well, officially. One example would be the 1882 French infantry officer saber, which has a straight blade. And that is because in France, in French nomenclature, the hilt is what determines what the sword is. So a certain kind of hilt, like the 1882, is a saber. So to kind of conclude this big rant on semantics and language and the meaning of words, what is the point of all of this? Why is it important to understand the historical context of the word scimitar and its weaknesses, but also the reasons why it exists, and why is it important to understand how the term storta kind of varies in meaning over the course of time, and why saber can mean different things, and why rapier doesn't exist in Italian, for example. Well, it's important because it kind of grounds us a little as people who communicate or talk about swords, whether it's in videos like this, or whether it's in academic settings, or whether it's in communities. And it should make us kind of think about how the ground, the significance ground we rely on or walk on is way more unstable and murky than we normally think. We tend to use terms very easily. Oh, it's a rapier. Oh yeah, it's a saber, of course. But that's not true everywhere. And that's kind of it. In terms of position, I don't really have one, in the sense that if the word scimitar disappears, that's perfectly fine. And if it stays with a certain kind of meaning, that's also fine. It's just languages evolve and change all the time. There's no real, there's no way for us to really direct them, in a sense. But I think what is important is that we can take this vagueness and this ability to kind of zoom in and out in terms of broadness of coverage and, you know, vagueness of meaning, or narrowness of coverage and specificity of meaning. And as communicators, or again, as sword enthusiasts, we can use it to our advantage, and the ability to be able to shift the way we talk about swords as we talk about different people, to different people, or as we talk in different settings about swords, is really important to be able to communicate the right information to the right people, and hopefully educate more and more people to a better knowledge of swords, or, you know, get more people into the community. There's nothing bad about that ever.